The snow did not fall that night. It attacked. Wade Calloway had lived through 11 Wyoming winters on this land, and he had learned one plain truth about them. A blizzard did not care who you were, what you owned, or who was waiting for you at home. It buried the weak and the strong with the same cold hand. So when he saw a shape lying half-covered near the fence line, dark cloth against white snow, his first thought was that some fool calf had wandered out and frozen. His second thought, the one that made him drop the lantern and run, was that the shape had the size and curve of a woman. He reached her in seconds that felt like minutes. Her lips had gone the color of ash. Her hands, bare and raw from the cold, were locked around the handle of a small leather satchel, as if she would rather freeze than let it go. Wade did not waste breath asking questions a half-dead woman could not answer. He lifted her, satchel and all, and carried her through snow that fought him for every step, back toward the one warm window on that frozen mountain. That was how it began. Not with an introduction, not with her name, not with anything but a debt owed to a storm that had almost taken a stranger's life on his land. Wade Calloway did not know yet that saving her would cost him more than any winter ever had. He did not know that months later, in the dust and sun of a summer he could not yet imagine, he would stand across from this same woman as if she were an enemy, while armed men watched to see which one of them would break first. He only knew that night that he was not going to let her die. The cabin was small, built for one man and built by that man's own hands. Wade laid her on the bed nearest the fire and got to work the way he worked cattle in a hailstorm fast, and without letting his mind wander to how bad the situation looked. He peeled off her soaked outer coat. He wrapped her in every blanket he owned. He built the fire up until the little room glowed orange, and still her lips stayed pale, and still she did not wake. For 3 hours he sat beside her, feeding the flames, listening to the wind, trying to tear the roof off his life. He was 34 years old, and he had buried a father, a mother, and a fiancée who had decided frontier life was not the life she wanted after all. He had built a wall around himself brick by careful brick, the way a man does when he has learned that caring about people is how you get hurt. He told himself he was only doing what any decent man would do. He told himself that more than once, because some part of him already suspected it was not entirely true. Near midnight, she stirred. Her eyes opened a clear, storm-gray color, sharp even through the fever, and the first thing she did was reach for the satchel he had set beside the bed. Her fingers closed around it before she even looked at him. Only then did she look at him, really look, the way a person looks at something they are trying to decide is a threat. "You're safe," Wade said. His voice came out rougher than he meant it to. He had not used it in days. "You're in my cabin. I found you in the snow." "How far?" she rasped. "From the road." "Not thank you. Not who are you. How far from the road?" Wade felt something in him go still and watchful, the way it did when he noticed a rattler in the grass before his boot came down. "For miles," he said. "You're not walking 4 miles tonight, ma'am. Not walking 4 miles for a week, most likely." Her eyes slid shut again, but her grip on the satchel did not loosen, even in sleep. Wade sat back in his chair and studied her properly for the first time. The fine stitching on her ruined dress, the soft hands that had never split a fence rail, the ledger-shaped weight she guarded like it held her own heartbeat. Whoever this woman was, she had not stumbled onto his land by accident. Something or someone had put her there. He should have been more careful about that thought. Instead, he banked the fire and stayed. He thought, sitting there in the dark with only the wind for company, about the last time he had let himself worry this much over another person. It had been Eleanor, 6 years back, the woman who had promised to marry him and then discovered, over one long, grinding winter much like this one, that she did not have the stomach for a life built out of frost and distance and work that never truly ended. She had left in the spring, gently, the way people leave when they have already decided but want credit for being kind about it. Wade had told himself afterward that the lesson in it was simple. A man who wanted to keep his footing on this land could not afford to build his balance around someone who might, at any moment, choose to walk away from it. And yet here he was again, watching a stranger's chest rise and fall by firelight, feeling something in him lean toward her the way a compass needle leans toward north, whether or not the man holding it wants to go that direction. He told himself it was only decency. He told himself that until the sky outside began to gray, and even then, he was not entirely sure he believed it. The next morning brought no change in the weather and little change in his patient, though her breathing had eased and the terrible paleness of her lips had softened into something closer to human color. Wade busied himself with chores that did not strictly need res-tacking would already stacked. Checking a harness he had checked twice the day before because sitting idle beside a sleeping stranger felt like a kind of trespass he was not ready to commit. It was mid-afternoon when she stirred again, this time with more strength behind it, enough that she managed to push herself half upright before a wave of dizziness put her back down against the pillow with a soft, frustrated sound. "Easy," Wade said, crossing the room in 3 strides. "Whatever's chasing you, it isn't getting through that door today. You don't have to prove anything to an empty cabin." "I wasn't trying to prove anything," she said, though the flush in her cheeks suggested otherwise. "I was trying to see how bad it was. How bad's the fever, or how bad's the trouble?" She looked at him then, really looked, weighing something behind those storm-gray eyes. "Both, I imagine," she said finally, and did not elaborate further, and Wade, mindful of his own rule about not demanding payment for a rescue, did not press. She woke fully 2 days later, into a body that ached everywhere and a mind that took a moment to remember why. The fever had broken sometime in the night, leaving her weak but clear. She found herself in an unfamiliar bed, wrapped in blankets that smelled of wood smoke and leather, with the satchel she checked immediately still tucked against her side. The man from before sat at a rough wooden table, mending a bridle with hands that looked like they had never once been idle. He was broader than she remembered from her fevered glimpse of him, with a jaw that carried a few days of stubble and eyes the deep brown of turned soil. When he noticed she was awake, he set the bridle down without hurry, as though he had all the patience in the world and none of the curiosity. "There's coffee if you can hold a cup," he said. "There's broth if you can't." "Coffee," she said, her voice cracked on the single word. He poured it without comment and set it within her reach rather than handing it to her, giving her the choice of whether to take his help. She noticed that. She noticed most things. It was, in a way, the reason she was lying in a stranger's cabin 4 miles from the nearest road instead of dead in a ditch somewhere outside Cheyenne. "You never told me your name," Wade said, when she had managed a few sips. She hesitated. In her old life, names were currency, and she had learned the hard way not to spend them carelessly. But something about this cabin, the silence, the honest smell of wood smoke, the man's unhurried patience made lying feel like an insult to the fact that he had carried her 4 miles through a killing storm. "Josephine," she said finally. "Josephine Dunmore. Most people call me Josie. Wade Calloway." He nodded once, as if filing the name away where it belonged. "You want to tell me why a woman dressed for a parlor was walking through a Wyoming blizzard with nothing but a satchel and a coat too thin for October?" Josie's hand found the satchel again, an old habit that had become an instinct. "No," she said. "Not yet. I'm sorry. It isn't that I don't trust you." "Didn't ask you to trust me," Wade said. "Asked you a question. You don't have to answer it." He picked the bridle back up. "Man who saves your life doesn't get to demand your secrets for payment. That's not how debts work, far as I'm concerned." It was, Josie thought, the strangest kindness anyone had shown her in a very long time. The kindness of a man who expected nothing in return, and meant it. She spent that first full day mostly sleeping, waking in pieces to find the cabin unchanged around her, the same low ceiling, the same smell of pine smoke and leather, the same quiet, watchful man moving through his chores with an economy of motion that told her he had done every single one of them alone for a very long time. There was a loneliness in that kind of competence, she thought, the loneliness of a person who has stopped expecting help and simply learned to need less of it. She recognized it because she had been building the same kind of competence in herself for 4 months, ever since a rockslide took the one person who had ever made her feel like she did not have to carry everything by herself. By the second evening, her strength had returned enough that she insisted on sitting at the table. Instead of the bed, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of horses and wood smoke, watching Wade work a piece of harness leather with the same patient attention he seemed to bring to everything. "You don't ask many questions," she said. breaking a silence that had stretched long enough to feel companionable rather than awkward. Learned a while back that most people tell you what they want you to know, when they're ready without you having to dig for it, Wade said, not looking up from the leather. Digging just teaches folks to hide things better. That's a very patient philosophy for a man who lives alone on a mountain. Living alone teaches a man patience, one way or another, Wade said. Cattle don't hurry for anybody. The weather doesn't either. He glanced up at her then, something almost like humor in his dark eyes. Guess I figured people might work the same way, if I gave them the chance. Josie found herself, unexpectedly, smiling the first real smile since the letter had arrived at her door in July, since her whole life had folded itself down into the size of a satchel and a single road out of Cheyenne. You might be the first patient man I've met in longer than I'd like to admit, she said. Might just be the first man who wasn't in a hurry to get something out of you, Wade said, and returned to his leatherwork, and let the observation sit between them without pressing it any further, which was, Josie was beginning to understand, exactly the kind of man he was. If a story like this one is the kind that keeps you up past your bedtime wondering what happens next, do us both a favor and hit subscribe before you go on. Costs nothing, and it means you will never miss the next one. The blizzard did not let up for 6 days. Wade had seen long storms before, but never one that seemed, in its own strange way, like a mercy. It gave him an excuse to sit across a small table from a woman whose sharp mind kept surprising him, and it gave Josie a wall of white outside every window, tall enough to hide her from a world she was not ready to face again. They fell into a rhythm without either one deciding to. Mornings, Wade tended the few cattle he had brought into the barn before the storm hit, and Josie, once her strength returned, insisted on helping however her ruined dress and borrowed boots allowed. Afternoons, they sat by the fire, Wade mending gear, Josie reading the handful of books he owned twice over, both of them talking more than either had talked to another living soul in years. She learned that he had lost his parents to a fever the same winter he turned 21, and had run the ranch alone ever since, because the alternative was to sell land his father had bled for. She learned that the fiancé he mentioned once, and only once, had left for Denver 8 years back and never looked back either. He learned, in careful pieces, that she had been a bookkeeper, a good one, meticulous, the kind of person who could make numbers confess things men twice her size never wanted to confess. He learned that she had grown up the daughter of a railroad surveyor, a man who taught her to read a ledger the way other fathers taught their daughters to read scripture. He learned nothing at all about why she had been running through a blizzard, and he stopped asking because he could see the asking cost her something. On the 4th night, with the wind still howling outside and the fire burned down to embers, Josie found herself talking anyway, without being asked. My father found something, she said quietly, staring into the coals. In his surveys, land parcels that didn't match what the company filed with the territory office. Numbers that moved. Boundaries that shifted on paper, always in the same direction toward men who could afford to make problems disappear. Wade did not interrupt. He had learned, in 4 days, that Josie talked like a woman defusing something dangerous slowly, carefully, and only when she trusted the room not to explode. He wrote it all down, she went on. Every discrepancy. He was going to take it to the territorial land office in the spring. Her hands, folded in her lap, tightened. He never got the chance. There was an accident. A rock slide, they called it, on a survey line he had ridden 100 times before. You don't believe it was an accident, Wade said. It was not a question. I believe accidents don't usually come with a warning delivered to my door 3 days later, Josie said. A single line, and signed. It said the ledger should stay buried with him. She looked up, and for the first time since he had pulled her from the snow, Wade saw not fear in her eyes, but something harder and colder. I took it instead. I have been running since July. Wade sat with that for a long moment, the fire popping softly between them. That satchel, he said finally. His notebook. Names, dates, file deeds against the false ones. Enough to end careers, if it ever reaches the right hands. She wrapped both arms around herself, as if the cabin had gone cold despite the fire. Enough to get me killed if it reaches the wrong ones first. Whose hands are you running from? Josie was quiet long enough that Wade thought she would not answer. "A company," she said at last. "Ashford Land and Rail. And a man they hire to make their problems quiet. His name is Reeve Talbot." She said the name the way a person names a sickness, hoping saying it plainly will rob it of some power. "He was 3 days behind me in Cheyenne. I don't know how far behind me now." Wade did not say anything reassuring, because he did not believe in comforting a person with lies. What he did instead was stand, walk to the door, and check that the bar across it was set firm, the way he checked it every night of that storm. But this time, Josie noticed, he checked it like a man expecting trouble, not weather. Later that night, long after the fire had burned low and Josie had finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, Wade lay awake on the narrow cot he had made for himself near the door, turning her story over in his mind the way he might turn over a stone in a creek bed, looking for the shape of the thing underneath. He had never had much use for railroads or land companies or the kind of men who moved paper instead of cattle for a living, but he understood theft well enough, whatever coat it wore. A man who stole a calf in the night was no different in his heart from a man who stole 100 acres with a forged signature, only the second man had better boots and a cleaner conscience, purchased the same way most clean consciences were, with money enough to never have to look at what it cost somebody else. Somewhere near midnight, a small, broken sound reached him from the bed. Not quite a cry, more the sound a person makes when a nightmare has them by the throat and has not yet let go. Wade was on his feet before he decided to be, crossing the room to find Josie thrashing weakly against blankets that had wound too tight around her, her face twisted with a fear that had nothing to do with the cold. "Josie!" He kept his voice low, steady, the same voice he used to gentle a spooked horse. "Josie, you're safe. You're in the cabin." Her eyes opened, wild for a moment before they found him, before the room around her resolved itself back into safety instead of whatever she had been dreaming. "I'm sorry," she said, breathless, pressing a hand to her chest. "I usually haven't slept well since July. Since my father." "No need to apologize for a bad dream." Wade crouched beside the bed, close enough to be steadying without crowding her. "You want to tell me about it? Or you want me to just sit here till it passes?" She was quiet for a long moment, her breathing slowly evening out. "Sit," she said finally, very small. "Please." So he sat on the cold floor beside her bed, saying nothing at all, until her breathing deepened again into real sleep, and only then did he allow himself to acknowledge, in the privacy of his own thoughts, how very far the stranger had already traveled past the careful walls he had spent 6 years building around himself. The days that followed fell into an easier rhythm than either of them expected. On the third morning, Josie insisted on helping him with chores despite his protests, and though her ruined dress and borrowed boots made for an odd picture against the barn's rough boards, she proved handier than he'd guessed, steady with the animals, quick to learn where things belonged, unafraid of the cold. Once she understood how to dress for it in his sister's old coat, kept in a trunk since a sister who had married and moved to Oregon years before. She laughed once at the sight of herself in a rancher's oversized boots, and the sound of it startled Wade more than the blizzard had. "You're not what I expected," he admitted that evening, watching her work a needle through a torn seam in his shirt with the same careful precision she must have once brought to her father's ledgers. "What did you expect?" "Didn't expect a bookkeeper to know one end of a pitchfork from the other," Wade said. "Didn't expect her to laugh either. Not the way you were running. Not with what's chasing you." Josie's needle paused. "My father used to say that a person who forgets how to laugh in hard times has already let the hard times win half the fight," she said quietly. "I've been trying very hard not to let them win, Wade Calloway. Some days I manage it better than others." "Seems to me," Wade said, "you're managing it just fine." "Then I suppose," he said, sitting back down, "we'll deal with that when the road's clear. Until then, Miss Dunmore, you're under my roof, and nobody gets through that door who isn't welcome." Something in Josie's chest loosened, just slightly, at the plain certainty in his voice. She had spent 4 months learning who she could not trust. She had forgotten, until this cabin, what it felt like to sit across from someone she could. It was on the 6th night, with the storm finally softening to a whisper against the windows, that the careful distance between them gave way to something neither had planned and neither regretted. There was no grand declaration, no promise neither of them was ready to make. There was only firelight, and two people who had each spent years guarding themselves against exactly this kind of danger, choosing for one quiet night to stop guarding. Before that final night arrived, though, there was a fifth evening Wade would remember for the rest of his life for a different reason entirely. The evening Josie told him, in full, who her father had been, not as a surveyor murdered for what he found, but as a man who had raised her to believe certain things about the world that the last 4 months had tested nearly past breaking. He used to say a ledger doesn't lie, she told Wade, staring into the fire with her knees drawn up beneath the borrowed blanket. Numbers can be hidden, or twisted, or buried under enough paperwork that nobody wants to dig them back out. But they don't lie, not really. Somewhere, if you look hard enough, the truth is always sitting there in black and white, waiting for somebody brave enough or stubborn enough to go find it. Sounds like a man worth being raised by, Wade said. He was. Josie's voice caught, just slightly. He believed that honesty was worth more than comfort, even when comfort was easier to come by and nobody would have blamed him for choosing it instead. I used to think that was just a nice thing fathers say to daughters. I didn't understand, until I watched what honesty actually cost him, how much he meant it. And now, Josie said, I suppose I'm finding out whether I meant it too, when I told myself I believed the same things he did. She looked at Wade then, a firelight catching the gray of her eyes. It's a great deal easier to believe in honesty when it isn't your own life on the other side of the scale. For what it's worth, Wade said quietly. The kind of honesty that costs a person something is usually the only kind worth having. Anybody can be honest when it's free. Josie was quiet for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, she reached over and took his hand not out of fear this time, or exhaustion, but out of something steadier than either. I don't think I've said anything true out loud to another person in 4 months, she admitted. Not one thing that wasn't measured first for how safe it was to say. Her fingers tightened around his. Thank you for being someone I could finally stop measuring around. In the morning, the sky outside was a hard, clean blue, and the world Josie had been hiding from was waiting for her again. Wade woke to an empty cabin and a fire went cold. He told himself, in the first foolish minute, that she had only gone to the barn, or to the spring house, or anywhere a person went in the ordinary business of a morning. But her boots were gone from beside the door. Her satchel was gone from where it always sat within arm's reach. And on the table, weighted down by the one book of poems he owned, was a folded note in handwriting so careful it looked almost printed. Wade, by the time you read this, I will be 3 or 4 hours down the South Road, and I am sorry for that more than I can put into a note this short. You gave me 6 days I did not think I deserved, and I will not repay that kindness by staying long enough to become the reason trouble finds your door. If Reeve Talbot's men are as close as I fear, they will not stop at hurting me. A man like that does not leave loose ends, and you would be one, simply for having known me. I would rather disappear into a world that already wants to swallow me than watch it reach for you too. Please don't come looking. I mean that as care, not rejection. Whatever this was, between the snow and the fire, I will not pretend it was nothing. I only know it cannot survive what is coming for me, and I refuse to let it cost you your life to find that out. Thank you for the 4 miles you carried me. I will spend the rest of mine trying to be worth them. Josie Wade read it twice, then a third time, standing in the doorway with the cold morning air pouring past him and not feeling it at all. On the table beside where the note had lain sat a single pearl earring, small and plain, left behind either by accident or as the only thing of value she had to leave as thanks. He picked it up and held it in a palm still calloused from years of rope and fence wire, and felt, for the first time since his parents' funeral, something in his chest crack clean through. He saddled his horse anyway. He rode the South Road for 3 hours before the tracks hers, and others, heavier boots joining hers near the fork by Miller's Creek, vanished onto the hard-packed stage road where 100 travelers a week left no trail worth following. He sat his horse at that crossroads a long time, staring at nothing, before he finally turned back toward the mountain. She had asked him not to look for her. It was, he told himself on the ride home, the one thing he could still give her even if giving it felt like tearing something out of his own chest with his bare hands. He did not know, riding back into the empty cabin that no longer felt like enough of a home, that Josie had watched the fork from a stand of trees a quarter-mile off, waiting to be sure Talbot's men had truly turned north instead of following her south. He did not know that she had pressed a hand over her own mouth to keep from calling out to him as he passed below her, so close she could have thrown a stone and hit his hat. He did not know any of that. He only knew that the cabin was quiet again, in a way it had never been quiet before she arrived, and that quiet, he was beginning to understand, was going to be a much harder thing to live inside than the loneliness he thought he had already mastered. He kept the earring in the top drawer of his father's old dresser, wrapped in a handkerchief, and told himself for the first several weeks that he had simply forgotten to throw it out. By the time spring came around and he still had not thrown it out, he stopped pretending the omission was an accident. Otis noticed the change in him before Wade said a word about it, the way a man notices weather shifting before the first cloud crosses the sun. He found Wade one gray March morning standing at the eastern fence line, staring out at nothing in particular, and did not ask what was wrong so much as simply stood beside him a while, the way old friends do when words would only get in the way. "You had somebody up here this winter," Otis said finally, not quite a question. "Storm before last. I noticed extra tracks around the barn before the thaw covered them, and you've been carrying yourself differently since." Wade did not deny it. There did not seem to be much point with Otis, who had known him since before he could sit a horse without help. "Found a woman half froze in the blizzard in October," he said. "Nursed her back. She left before the roads cleared. She says why. Said she didn't want to bring trouble to my door." Wade's jaw tightened. "Didn't say where she was going, or whether I'd see her again. Just said not to look." Otis was quiet for a moment, turning that over. "You gonna listen to her?" "Been trying to," Wade admitted. "Not sure I'm any good at it." "Man in love rarely is," Otis said, with the plain, unhurried certainty of someone twice Wade's age, who had buried a wife of his own and knew exactly what that particular kind of quiet cost a person. He did not offer any further comfort than that, and Wade, standing at the fence line with a mountain full of work waiting and a hollow place in his chest that no amount of work seemed able to fill, found he did not need any more than that plain, unhurried truth, spoken once and then left alone to settle. 7 months passed the way winters do in cattle country slowly. Then all at once, Wade threw himself back into the work of the ranch with the particular fury of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. He fixed every fence that did not need fixing. He broke 2 young horses nobody had asked him to break. He worked from the black of early morning until his body was too tired to lie awake wondering where a gray-eyed woman with a dangerous secret had ended up. His foreman, a weathered, good-natured man named Otis Reyes who had worked the Calloway land since before Wade could walk, watched all this with the patient concern of a man who had buried his own share of grief and knew better than to poke at another man too soon. "You're going to run yourself into the ground, boss?" Otis said one evening in April, finding Wade still out mending tack well after dark. "Ground's not going anywhere," Wade said. "Figured I'd get some use out of it before it gets me." Otis let that sit a moment. "She said she was coming back?" Wade's hands stilled on the leather. He had never told Otis the whole of it, only that a woman had stayed the winter and left before the thaw, but Otis had known him since he was a boy, and some things a person did not have to say out loud to be understood. "She said not to look for her," Wade said finally. "That's not the same thing as coming back." "No," Otis agreed. "It isn't." He did not offer false comfort, and Wade was grateful for that more than he could have said. Spring turned to early summer, and with it came a different kind of trouble, the kind Wade could see coming, which somehow made it no easier to face. A survey crew appeared at the eastern edge of his property in May, driving stakes into ground that had belonged to his family for 3 generations. When Wade rode out to ask what in creation they thought they were doing, the lead surveyor handed him a letter on heavy company stationery, embossed at the top with a name that made the note Josie had left him feel suddenly, sickeningly relevant. Ashford Land and Rail Company. The letter was polite in the way that only truly dangerous documents ever bothered to be polite. It informed Wade Calloway that recent title research had revealed an irregularity in the original land patent for his ranch, and that the Ashford Company, holding the superior claim through a prior unrecorded grant, would be pursuing the matter through the Territorial Land Office. A company representative would arrive within the month to discuss an equitable resolution. Wade read it twice standing in his own east pasture, the same way he had read Josie's note twice standing in his own doorway 7 months before. Both letters had cost him something he could not immediately name. This one at least made him angry instead of hollow, and anger Wade found was a great deal easier to work with. Irregularity, he said aloud to no one, and the surveyors wisely found something else to look at. Before he rode for town, Wade made one stop at the Prescott place, 2 miles down the valley, where old Ansel Prescott had run cattle on land his own father had settled the same year as Wade's grandfather. He found the old man sitting on his porch in the June heat looking a decade older than he had at the spring roundup, a half-empty bottle beside him that Wade had never once seen Ansel Prescott touch before noon. "They get to you too?" Ansel asked, without preamble, when Wade explained why he'd come. "Filed papers on the east pasture 2 days back," Wade said. "You? Whole South Range," Ansel said flatly. "40 years my family's run cattle on that ground. And some company clerk in Cheyenne says my deeds got a clerical error nobody ever mentioned in 40 years of paying taxes on it clean." He took a slow pull from the bottle, not offering any to Wade. "The lawyer I hired says it'll cost more to fight than the land's worth. Says settle and take what they offer before they offer nothing at all." "What are you going to do?" Ansel looked out over land he had ridden every day of his life and something in his weathered face cracked, just slightly. "I'm 61 years old, Wade. I don't have the fight left in me that you've got in you. Maybe you'll do better against them than I managed to." He did not sound bitter, exactly only tired, in the particular way of a man who has already watched himself lose before the fight was even properly joined. Wade rode away from the Prescott place with that tiredness sitting heavy in his own chest. A preview, he suspected, of exactly what Ashford Land and Rail intended for every small holding in the valley. One quiet, exhausted surrender at a time. It only hardened his resolve by the time he reached Hollis Bramwell's office door. He spent 3 hours in the dusty back office of Hollis Bramwell, the only lawyer for 60 miles who had not yet been bought by somebody with deeper pockets. Bramwell pored over Wade's deed. The original, signed by Wade's grandfather, filed and recorded the year the territory itself was young, and shook his head slowly. "This deed's clean, Wade. Cleaner than clean. Whatever Ashford's claiming, it isn't standing on solid ground." He set the paper down carefully, the way a man handles something he suspects is more valuable than it looks. "Which tells me one thing." "What's that?" "That somebody at that company is planning to make solid ground out of paper that doesn't exist yet." Bramwell's eyes met Wade's grave. "I've heard rumors about this outfit before. Small ranchers up near the Belle Fourche losing land to filings that turn up conveniently after the fact, in courthouses with clerks who suddenly can't recall approving them. Nobody's proven anything. Nobody's dared to try." Wade thought, unbidden, of a leather satchel gripped white-knuckled through a blizzard, and a ledger full of numbers that moved, and a name Josie had spoken like a sickness. Reeve Talbot, Ashford Land and Rail. He said nothing of it to Bramwell. Some instincts a man does not question, only obeys, and every instinct in Wade Calloway told him that the woman he had failed to forget and the company now circling his family's land were not two separate storms, but the same one, returning to finish what it had started. He was not wrong. 60 miles east, in a wood-paneled office above the newest branch of Ashford Land and Rail, Randall Ashford himself was, at that very hour, reviewing a list of parcels with the calm efficiency of a man balancing household accounts rather than plotting the quiet ruin of a dozen families. He checked names off with a neat pencil mark, murmuring notations to the clerk seated across from him, a young woman with sharp gray eyes and careful posture who had joined the company only that spring, on the strength of a letter of recommendation from a surveyor's estate that Ashford's staff had not thought to question closely enough. "Calloway parcel," Ashford said, tapping the page. "Prime grazing land, good water rights, close enough to the rail line to be worth the trouble. See that the boundary correction filing is dated properly this time, Miss Dunmore. The Prescott filing raised a few too many eyebrows at the land office last month. We'll want this one cleaner." "Of course, Mr. Ashford," Josie said, her pencil steady on her own notepad, betraying nothing at all of the fact that the name on the page belonged to the man who had carried her 4 miles through a blizzard the previous October, or that every word out of Randall Ashford's mouth was, in that moment, being committed to a memory considerably sharper than the notes she was pretending to take. Ashford did not notice. Men who had spent decades assuming the world existed to be managed rarely noticed the people managing them in return, until it was already too late to stop it. The Ashford Company's representative arrived on the first truly hot day of June, riding into town on the noon stage in a cloud of dust that seemed almost theatrical in its timing. Word had reached Wade an hour earlier that the company's man wanted to meet at the Calloway ranch itself, to survey the disputed acreage in person. And so Wade was standing in his own courtyard, Otis and 6 of his hands gathered loosely behind him, when the stage door opened and a woman stepped down instead of the man everyone had expected. For one full second, Wade's mind refused to accept what his eyes were telling him. She wore a traveling dress of pale, expensive linen, her hair pinned with a precision that had nothing of the storm-tossed woman he remembered. Her chin was lifted, her spine straight as a fence post, every line of her arranged into the posture of a woman who belonged in boardrooms and never once in a snowbank. Only her eyes gave her away the same clear gray, though guarded now behind something colder than he had ever seen there before. "Miss Dunmore," Wade said, and was proud later of how level his voice came out. "Mr." The survey took the better part of 2 hours, Josie walking the boundary with a company theodolite and a notebook, calling out measurements in a clipped, professional voice to the man assisting her while Wade watched from the porch, arms crossed, saying nothing. Every so often her eyes would flick toward him, quick and unreadable, before returning to her instruments with the same practiced focus. If he had not spent 6 days learning the particular language of her face, he might have believed the coldness entirely. Otis brought him coffee around mid-afternoon, standing beside him with the same watchful patience he'd shown at the fence line in March. "She's thorough," he observed, nodding toward Josie as she double-checked a measurement near the creek. "She's always been thorough," Wade said. "It's part of what makes her good at whatever she's actually doing out there. You don't think she's really here to steal your land?" "I don't know what I think," Wade admitted. "I know the woman who left me a note in October wasn't the kind to turn around and help a company murder her own father's memory for a wage. Whatever's happening, it isn't what it looks like on the surface. I just don't know yet what's underneath." When the survey finally concluded, Josie approached him directly for the first time since stepping off the stage, her company ledger held against her chest like a shield. "I'll be filing my report with the territorial office within the week," she said, voice pitched for the benefit of the armed men still watching from the corral. "I'd advise you to consult your own counsel regarding the company's findings, Mr. Calloway. Ashford Land and Rail does not typically negotiate favorable terms with landowners who choose to be difficult about matters of clear legal record. I intend to be exactly as difficult as the situation requires, Miss Dunmore," Wade said, matching her formal tone with an edge of his own. "You can put that in your report too." Something crossed her face, then too quick for the watching men to catch, but not too quick for Wade, a flicker of something that looked almost like pride, buried under the careful company mask. "I'll note your position," she said, and turned to go, and it was only as she climbed back into the wagon that her eyes found his one final time, holding a fraction of a second longer than professional courtesy required, long enough to say something neither of them could yet say out loud. Wade watched the wagon pull away in a fresh cloud of dust, Reeve Talbot's men falling in behind it like an escort or a guard, and found himself thinking that whatever game Josie Dunmore was playing, she was playing it dangerously close to the edge of her own survival. She came to him 3 nights later, well past midnight, tapping so softly on the cabin door that Wade, who had barely been sleeping since the courtyard, heard it only because he was already awake. He opened the door to find her out of the linen dress and back in plain traveling clothes, no armed escort in sight, her careful company posture gone entirely. What was left underneath it looked exhausted and frightened, and more like the woman he remembered than anyone he had seen step off that stage. 5 minutes, she whispered, slipping past him into the dark cabin without waiting for an invitation. "That's all the head start I have before they notice I'm not in my room at the boarding house. Josie, I'm not with them." She said it fast, low, urgent, before he could say anything else. "I mean, I am on paper in every filing and every ledger they've got. But I am not with them, Wade. And I need you to believe that faster than I have time to prove it. Wade studied her face in the dim moonlight through the window, and made a decision he would have made even without 7 months and a note tucked in his drawer to weigh on him. I believe you, he said. Now tell me why. Josie let out a breath like she had been holding it since the courtyard. The company I worked for before all this Ashford land and rail. They didn't just steal my father's survey findings and bury him under a rockslide because he found a filing error. He found a pattern. Dozens of small ranches, boundary lines quietly redrawn in filings that appear in county records years after the fact, always favoring Ashford's holdings. Always right before the railroad needs a right-of-way through land the company doesn't legally own yet. She pulled a folded page from inside her sleeve. Not the whole ledger, Wade noticed, only a piece of it, kept separate and safer than the rest. Your ranch is on the list, Wade. It has been for over a year. They were only waiting for the railroad survey to reach this valley to make their move. So you came back to warn me. I came back, Josie said. Because after I ran from you, I didn't just disappear into nowhere. I went to the Territorial Land Commission in Cheyenne and told them everything my father found. They believed me enough to act, not enough to move fast, because Ashford has friends in that office too. So they asked me to do something I did not want to do. Her hand tightened on the folded page. They asked me to go back to Ashford, apply for a position using my father's old reputation as a surveyor's daughter, and get close enough to find the rest of the ledger, the copies my father made before he died. The ones that would hold up in a real court instead of a bought one. Wade absorbed that in silence. You've been spying on them. For months. For 4 months, Josie confirmed. Long enough to know Randall Ashford himself signs off on every falsified filing personally. Long enough to know he's brought Reeve Talbot back onto the payroll, officially this time as head of field security. Her voice caught just slightly on the name. Long enough to know that if they ever suspect what I actually am, I will disappear the same way my father did, and it will be called an accident too. Then walk away from it, Wade said, low and urgent, closing the distance between them. Right now. Tonight. Come back to the ranch, and You'll what, Wade? Josie's eyes, gray and exhausted and fierce all at once, met his without flinching. Hide me in your cabin until they find both of us? I am the only person inside that company who can find proof strong enough to end this. If I run now, they win, and they don't just take your land, they take the next ranchers, and the one after that, forever, because nobody with real evidence ever stood still long enough to stop them. Wade wanted badly to argue with that. He found, studying the set of her jaw, that he could not honestly, not as a man who respected her enough to have carried her 4 miles through a blizzard in the first place. Then I'm not letting you do it. Alone, he said instead. You already are alone in this fight. Whether I help you or not, they're coming for your land regardless. Josie folded the page and pressed it into his hand, closing his fingers around it. This is a copy of the false filing they intend to submit against you. Give it to your lawyer. It won't stop them, but it will slow them, and slowing them is time I need. She was already moving back toward the door, back toward the careful coldness she would have to wear again by sunrise. I have to go before they notice. Josie. Wade caught her hand before she reached the latch. That earring you left me. I still have it. For just a moment, the coldness cracked entirely, and the woman from the snowbound cabin looked back at him, unguarded and afraid and unmistakably still his. Keep it safe, she whispered. The same way you're going to keep yourself safe whatever happens between now and the day this is over. Promise me that much, Wade Calloway. He did not promise because he did not believe in promises he might not be able to keep. Instead, he pressed a kiss to her knuckles, rough hand against soft one, and let her go into the dark, trusting her this time, instead of chasing her. It was, he would think later, both the hardest and the easiest thing he had ever done. He did not sleep after she left. Instead, he sat at his own table, in the dark, turning the folded page she had given him over in his hands until he had nearly memorized every line of it, and thought about what she had said, that if she ran now, Ashford would simply take the next rancher's land, and the one after that, forever, because no one with the evidence to stop them had ever stood still long enough to try. It was not so different, he realized, from the choice he had made every winter of his adult life, staying on land that would have been easier, by any practical measure, to sell and walk away from. There was a kind of stubbornness in both choices, the kind that cost a person comfort in exchange for something harder to name, the simple, unglamorous decency of refusing to let the wrong thing win simply because winning would have been easier. He thought, too, about his father, who had told him once, mending fences in weather not unlike this, that a man's whole life could generally be measured by what he was willing to lose sleep over. Wade had lost plenty of sleep over cattle prices and drought years, and a fiancée who had decided this life was not worth the trouble of loving him through. He found, turning Josie's stolen page over in the firelight, that he did not resent losing sleep over this instead. If anything, it felt like the first thing in years worth staying awake for. By the time the sun rose, he had made two decisions. The first was that he would ride into town at first light and put the page directly into Hollis Bramwell's hands, exactly as she had asked. The second, one he did not share with Bramwell or with anyone else for a long while yet, was that whatever happened between now and whatever ending this story was building toward, he was not going to let Josie Dunmore face Randall Ashford and Reeve Talbot alone, her orders to stay away be damned. Some promises, he had decided, were worth breaking the moment you made them, if the person you were breaking them for was worth more than your own word. The false filing Josie had smuggled to him bought Wade exactly 11 days before Hollis Bramwell came riding out to the ranch himself, hat in hand and face grim, in a way that told Wade the news before a single word was spoken. "They filed it," Bramwell said, dismounting, "this morning at the territorial office. Claim of superior title, backed by a survey correction dated 18 years before your grandfather's patent." He handed Wade a copy, the same false document Josie had already shown him, now stamped and made official in a system that was supposed to protect men like Wade instead of swallowing them. "On paper it looks clean. It looks like the truth. That's what worries me." "It's not the truth," Wade said. "I've got proof it's not." "Proof from where?" Bramwell asked, and there was no accusation in it, only a lawyer's plain need to know what he was working with. Wade hesitated. He had not told anyone, not Otis, not Bramwell, the full truth of where his information came from, because every extra person who knew Josie's secret was another person who could accidentally spend it. But Bramwell had known Wade's family for 20 years, and trust, Wade decided, had to start somewhere if this fight was going to be won at all. He was midway through the careful, edited version of the truth. A source inside the company, unnamed, credible when a writer Wade recognized turned in at the gate, and the sentence died in his throat. Marcus Doyle had grown up 2 ranches over from the Calloways, close enough in age and circumstance that he and Wade had once been near enough to brothers. They had broken horses together as boys, gotten thrown from the same green colt within a week of each other, stood up for one another in more fistfights and hard winters than either could count. Marcus had left for railroad work 6 years back, chasing wages the cattle business could not match, and Wade had not laid eyes on him since. He did not look like a railroad laborer now. His clothes were too fine, his horse too well bred, and the smile he wore riding into the courtyard did not reach eyes that would not quite meet Wade's. "Wade Calloway," Marcus said, swinging down easy as anything. "Been too long, old friend." "Marcus." Wade shook the offered hand out of old habit more than welcome. "What brings you out this way?" "Ashford Land and Rail," Marcus said, and something in Wade's stomach went cold even before the rest of the sentence landed. "I'm a regional agent for them now, Wade. It has been 3 years. I asked specially to be the one who came out here when I saw your name on the filing." He spread his hands, an old, easy gesture Wade remembered from 100 boyhood arguments. Thought a familiar face might make this whole business go down smoother than it would with a stranger. Bramwell's expression had gone carefully neutral, a lawyer's face for a lawyer's situation. Wade felt something harder settle behind his own ribs. "There's no smooth way to steal a man's land, Marcus," he said. "Not even with a familiar face doing the talking. Nobody's stealing anything." Marcus's smile did not waver, but something underneath it did. "The company's got documentation, Wade. Old survey records, filed proper. I know it feels unfair, but the law's the law, and fighting it just costs you money you could be saving for a fair settlement instead." He softened his voice the way he used to when talking Wade down from some fool teenage risk. "I could help make sure you got a good one. For old time's sake. A good settlement, Wade repeated slowly. For land my grandfather bled to clear, based on a filing you and I both know is fabricated. Something flickered across Marcus's face. Not quite guilt, but close enough kin to it that Wade recognized the family resemblance. I don't know anything about fabrication, Marcus said, too quickly. I just process the paperwork they give me. Then maybe, Wade said, it's time you asked a few more questions about that paperwork before you ride out to sell it to old friends. Marcus's jaw tightened. For just a moment, something older and rawer showed through the polished company manner, not the confident agent who had ridden in, but a man who had clearly made a bargain with himself some years back and did not much like being reminded of its price. Careful, Wade, he said low. I came out here as a courtesy. Ashford doesn't send everybody a courtesy call. Talbot's methods are considerably less friendly, and he's the one they'll send next if this doesn't settle easy. That sounds like a threat, Bramwell said mildly, breaking his silence at last. It's a fact, Marcus said, already turning back toward his horse, the easy boyhood warmth gone from his voice entirely now. Same as it's a fact that I'd rather you kept me on this account than force the company to send somebody who won't remember you used to be his friend. He rode out the way he'd ridden in, unhurried, leaving Wade standing in the yard with a coldness in his chest that had nothing to do with the season. Do you trust him? Bramwell asked quietly. I did, Wade said. Once. He watched the dust of Marcus's horse settle back down over the road. Man doesn't come out here dressed like that, working for people like that, without having sold something of himself along the way. The question is how much of him is left to sell back. He did not yet know how right or how dangerous that question would turn out to be. That evening, alone in the cabin, Wade found himself thinking back to a summer when he and Marcus were 14 years old, sharing a single fishing pole between 2 ranches worth of chores neither of them wanted to finish. Marcus had always been the one with bigger dreams, talking of leaving the valley, seeing a city, making money that didn't depend on rain falling in the right months of the right years. Wade had never begrudged him that dream. He had simply never expected the dream to cost Marcus quite this much of himself along the way. Bramwell stayed for supper that evening, turning the false filing over and over in his hands like a puzzle he was determined to solve by sheer persistence. There's a pattern to fraud like this, he said, around a mouthful of the beans Wade had put together. It's rarely just one bad man at the top. Takes clerks to file it, surveyors to sign it, agents to sell it to the folks it's stealing from. Every one of those people knows, on some level, what they're party to. Most of them just decide the wage is worth not looking too close. You think Marcus knows? I think, Bramwell said carefully, that a man doesn't dress the way he was dressed today, or ride a horse worth what that horse was worth, on a clerk's honest wage. Whether he's decided to stop looking close, or whether he's finally started looking closer than the company would like that, Wade, I couldn't tell you. Man's heart isn't something I can read off a filing. Wade turned that over long after Bramwell had ridden home, remembering the flicker he'd seen cross Marcus's face in the courtyard, not quite guilty, but close enough kin to it. He did not yet know which version of his old friend he was dealing with. He suspected, uneasily, that Marcus Doyle might not entirely know either. Word came to Josie 3 days later, delivered in the clipped, businesslike tone Randall Ashford used for even his most ruthless decisions, as though cruelty were simply another line item to be managed efficiently. The railroad's final stretch into the valley would be completed within the month. Ashford intended to mark the occasion with a public dedication ceremony, the driving of a ceremonial spike, a celebration for the whole territory, newspapers invited from as far as Cheyenne. And on that same day, quietly, without fanfare, the company would finalize its claim over the Calloway Ranch and several smaller holdings along the new rail line, using the very public, very celebratory atmosphere to make any resistance look small and ungrateful by comparison. Later that same evening, after the staff meeting had dispersed and the office above the mercantile had emptied out, Ashford poured 2 glasses of whiskey. He did not offer to share with anyone below his own rank, and studied Reeve Talbot across the width of his desk with the particular coldness of a man discussing an unpleasant but necessary expense. The Calloway matter has dragged longer than I'd like, Ashford said. His lawyer's been making inquiries at the county recorder's office. Nothing that will hold up, but inquiries all the same. Bramwell, Talbot said. I've had a man watching his office. See that his inquiries go nowhere. And see that Calloway himself understands, before the dedication, precisely how unwise further resistance would be. Ashford swirled the whiskey in his glass without drinking it. I'd prefer this concluded without incident. But I'll not have one stubborn rancher unravel 18 months of careful work over a matter of sentiment. And if unwise doesn't it take? Ashford's pale eyes flicked up, and for just a moment, the calm businessman's mask slipped enough to show something considerably colder underneath. Then I trust you to handle it the way you've handled similar matters before, Mr. Talbot. Quietly, and nowhere near enough witnesses to make it inconvenient afterward. Talbot allowed himself something close to a smile. Understood. It was this same calm, methodical cruelty that Ashford brought the following morning to his assembled staff, Josie included, standing at the front of the temporary office above the mercantile with the easy confidence of a man who had never once imagined the woman taking careful notes at the back of the room might be the very inquiry he could not quiet. A gift to the whole territory, Ashford told them. He was a compact, silver-haired man whose calm never once matched the violence of what he ordered done. And a fine day to close a few outstanding matters quietly, while everyone's attention is on the spike. His eyes moved to Josie without any particular weight, and that, more than anything, told her how completely he still trusted the identity she had built for herself. Miss Dunmore, I'll want the Calloway paperwork finalized and ready to file the moment the ceremony concludes. See that it's done. Of course, Mr. Ashford, Josie said, and hated the steadiness of her own voice. She found Marcus Doyle waiting for her in the hallway afterward, an unreadable look on his face that she had learned, over 4 careful months, meant he wanted to say something he had not yet worked up the courage for. You've been quiet since the Calloway ranch, Marcus said, since you rode out there with the survey team. I do my job quietly, Josie said. It's why Mr. Ashford trusts me with it. I grew up 2 ranches over from Wade Calloway, Marcus said, and there it was, the thing he had been working himself toward. Rode with him since we were boys. I went out there myself, a few days back, to talk him into a settlement. His jaw worked. He looked at me like I was something he'd found in the bottom of a boot. Josie kept her face carefully still, though her pulse had climbed sharply. I'm not sure why you're telling me this, Mr. Doyle, because I've seen a lot of filings cross my desk in 3 years with this company, Marcus said, voice dropping lower, and I've stopped letting myself look too close at most of them, on account of the wages being good and the questions being dangerous. But I looked closely at the Calloway filing, Miss Dunmore. Real close. And I don't like what I found. Josie's heart was hammering now, though she kept her hands folded and her expression composed through long practice. What did you find? The survey correction they're using is dated to a surveyor who left the territory the year before it claims he filed it, Marcus said. I checked the county's own records myself, quiet, on my own time. It's fabricated. Same as I suspect every other filing on Ashford's irregular boundary list is fabricated, going back years. He looked at her hard, searching. You've been out there. You've talked to Calloway. I need to know if you're the kind of person who'd do something about a thing like that, or the kind who's decided, same as I did, that it's easier not to. For one long, dangerous moment, Josie considered telling him everything. He had, after all, just handed her the one piece of independent confirmation she needed from a company man's own admission that the fraud was real, dated, provable. But 4 months inside Ashford's operation had taught her exactly how easily even a man's genuine guilt could be turned into a weapon against the person who trusted him with it, and she did not yet know which version of Marcus Doyle she was standing in front of. I'm the kind of person who does her job, Josie said carefully, and doesn't ask questions that could cost her that job, Mr. Doyle. I'd advise you to consider doing the same. Something in Marcus's face felt disappointment. She realized, not at her answer but at himself, for having hoped she would be braver than he had let himself be. Right, he said quietly. Of course. He turned to go, then stopped, not quite looking back at her. For what it's worth, if you ever did decide to be that kind of person, and you needed a filing clerk who knows exactly which drawer the real records are locked in, you'd know where to find me. He walked away before she could answer, and Josie stood alone in the hallway with her pulse still hammering, turning over a single, dangerous, necessary question. Whether a man who had spent 3 years selling pieces of his conscience for a good wage could be trusted to buy the last of it back, all at once when it mattered most. She would not have long to find out. The dedication ceremony was set for 3 weeks from that morning, and Reeve Talbot, she had learned that same afternoon, had already begun quietly moving armed men into position along the valley road. She encountered Talbot himself later that same day, in the narrow hallway outside Ashford's office, and the sheer unhurried menace of him never failed to raise the small hairs at the back of her neck, however many months she had spent learning to hide it. He was not a large man, not in the way the dime novels described gunmen, but he carried himself with the flat, economical stillness of someone who had made peace, long ago, with being the last thing several people ever saw. "Miss Dunmore," he said, blocking just enough of the hallway that she would have to ask to pass. "Mr. Ashford tells me you've taken a particular interest in the Calloway filing. Personally, I mean, beyond the paperwork. I go where Mr. Ashford assigns me," Josie said, keeping her voice as flat and unbothered as she could manage. "Funny thing," Talbot said, studying her with eyes that missed very little. "I rode out to that ranch myself, back in the fall, chasing a woman who'd taken something that didn't belong to her. Lost her trail in a blizzard, if you can believe it. Never did find out what happened to her." His gaze did not waver from hers. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you, Miss Dunmore? Seeing as you spend so much time going that direction." Every instinct Josie possessed screamed at her to look away, to fidget, to do any of the small human things a frightened person does under scrutiny like that. She had learned, over 4 months, to do none of them. "I know the Calloway Ranch is one of several parcels under review," she said evenly. "I don't make a habit of chasing rumors, Mr. Talbot. I make a habit of finishing my assignments." Talbot's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "See what you do," he said, and stepped aside at last, letting her pass. "Be a shame if finishing this one turned out to cost you more than you bargained for." She did not let her hands shake until she had rounded the corner and put 2 closed doors between herself and that hallway. It was, she thought grimly, the closest Talbot had come yet to telling her, without quite saying it, that he already suspected exactly who she was. The day of the ceremonial spike dawned clear and hot, the kind of high summer morning that seemed to Wade almost cruel in its beauty, given what he suspected the day was going to cost. The whole territory had turned out for it: ranch families, townsfolk, a brass band imported from Cheyenne, and a newspaperman scribbling notes for a story that Randall Ashford fully intended to be about progress and prosperity, not about the small ranches quietly being erased from the county's deed books before the ink on the celebration was even dry. Wade stood near the platform with Otis and a half-dozen of his hands, not because he expected trouble from a crowd, but because Bramwell's warning from 3 days before still echoed in his mind. "Ashford means to finalize the Calloway filing the moment this ceremony ends. Whatever you intend to do about it, do it before that spike goes in." He caught sight of Josie near the platform's edge, dressed once more in the company's careful, expensive linen, a ledger under her arm that Wade now understood was not the false one at all. She met his eyes for the briefest moment across the crowd, a warning or a promise. He could not yet tell which before Randall Ashford himself climbed the platform steps to address the gathered territory. Ashford's speech was smooth, practiced, full of words like opportunity and unity and the future we are building together. Wade barely heard it. His attention was on Reeve Talbot, positioned at the platform's base with 3 armed men Wade did not recognize, all of them watching the crowd with the flat, professional attention of men waiting for a signal. The signal came the moment Ashford finished speaking and gestured Josie forward to present the ceremonial land grant records, a formality, meant to look like celebration, that Wade now understood was the exact mechanism by which his own ranch was about to be legally, publicly stolen in front of the entire territory. Josie stepped up beside Ashford with the ledger, and for one terrible second, Wade thought she meant to hand it over exactly as ordered. Instead, she opened it to the crowd. "Before this territory celebrates what Mr. Ashford has built," Josie said, her voice carrying clear and steady across the gathered hundreds, "I think the people standing here deserve to know what it was built on." Ashford's smile did not move, but something behind his eyes went sharp and cold. "Miss Dunmore, this is hardly the appropriate this ledger," Josie continued, raising her voice over him. "Contains the original survey filings for every parcel Ashford Land and Rail has claimed under boundary correction in the past 6 years, filings that were altered, backdated, and in several cases attributed to surveyors who had already left the territory before the dates recorded on the documents." She turned a page, holding it high enough for the front rows to see the columns of careful handwriting. "Including the parcel belonging to Wade Calloway, whose family has held clean, recorded title to that land for 3 generations. The crowd's murmur rose sharply. Ashford's composed mask finally cracked. "That is a fabrication," he said, loud enough now to fight for the crowd's attention. "Produced by a disgruntled former employee with a grudge against this company." "My father was not disgruntled, Mr. Ashford," Josie said, and her voice, for the first time, shook with something other than fear. "He was murdered for finding exactly what is written in this book. And I did not spend 4 months inside your company, lying to everyone including the man I love, to watch you call the truth a fabrication in front of the people you intend to keep stealing from." Reeve Talbot moved first, and moved fast, a hand toward the pistol at his hip. A step toward the platform that every instinct in Wade recognized as the start of something meant to end with Josie silenced before another word left her mouth. Wade was already moving, shoving through the crowd, when a voice cut across the chaos that he had not expected to hear at all. "That's enough, Reeve." Marcus Doyle stood near the platform steps, a second ledger in his own hands, the company's internal filing records, the ones only a clerk with access to every locked drawer in the office could have gathered. "I've got the original correspondence," Marcus called out, loud enough for the crowd and the newspaperman both to hear clearly. "Ashford's own letters, ordering the backdated filings personally. I should have come forward with this a long time ago. I'm doing it now." Talbot did not hesitate at the betrayal so much as he simply recalculated, his pistol swinging from Josie toward Marcus in one smooth, practiced motion, and it was in that half-second of Talbot's attention shifting that Wade reached the platform and threw himself between Talbot's gun and the only 2 people trying to tell the truth in front of 1,000 witnesses. For one frozen instant, the whole platform seemed to hang suspended, Talbot's pistol swinging, Marcus standing his ground with the ledger clutched like a shield that could stop nothing, Josie's mouth opening on a warning that would come too late, Ashford's face gone the color of old ash as he watched, in real time, every year of careful theft come apart in front of a newspaperman's pencil. Wade had time for exactly one thought, clear and simple as anything he had ever known. That he had already lost one person he loved to a decision made in a single unguarded second, and he was not going to lose this one the same way, not while his own body still stood between her and the danger. The shot that rang out took Wade high in the shoulder, spinning him hard against the platform rail. The crowd's murmur broke into screaming. And in the chaos that followed, Otis and Wade's hands surging forward, territorial deputies who had been quietly stationed by Bramwell's own arrangement finally moving in, Ashford shouting orders nobody obeyed anymore. Reeve Talbot found himself surrounded on every side by men who had stopped being afraid of him the moment his one advantage, secrecy, burned away in the summer sun. He dropped the pistol. There was nothing else left to do. Wade did not see the rest of it clearly. Talbot disarmed, Ashford's protests dissolving into the particular silence of a man who has just watched his entire operation collapse in front of a newspaperman. Marcus Doyle standing very still with his ledger clutched to his chest like the only clean thing he owned. What Wade saw, through pain and a spreading warmth at his shoulder that told him the wound was worse than he wanted to admit, was Josie's face above him, gray eyes wide with a fear that had nothing to do with Ashford Land and Rail at all. "Stay with me," she said, pressing both hands hard against his shoulder. Her careful company composure gone entirely, nothing left but the woman from the snowbound cabin. "Wade Calloway, you carried me 4 miles through a blizzard. You do not get to bleed out on me in front of the whole territory over a railroad spike." "Wasn't planning on it," Wade managed, and even bleeding on a platform in front of 1,000 witnesses, he found he could still make her almost smile. "Somebody's got to keep an eye on you. You've got a habit of running into trouble." "Look who's talking," Josie said, and held on tight, all the way until the doctor arrived. The territorial deputies took Reeve Talbot into custody without further resistance. His one advantage, the fear his name carried, having burned away entirely the moment 1,000 witnesses watched him shoot an unarmed rancher in broad daylight. Randall Ashford tried, for a few final minutes, to talk his way free of the growing crowd of angry ranchers and scribbling newspapermen, insisting the whole matter was a misunderstanding that his lawyers would resolve by morning. It was Bramwell, of all people, who finally silenced him, stepping onto the platform with a folder of his own careful research and reading aloud, in a lawyer's clear, carrying voice, the exact dates and names that proved 11 separate filings across the valley had been altered under Ashford's personal signature. By the time the doctor finished digging the bullet from Wade's shoulder on a table borrowed from the mercantile, Ashford himself was under guard. His silver composure finally, completely gone, replaced by the particular panic of a man watching a fortune built on other people's ruin collapse in a single hot afternoon. "You'll live," the doctor told Wade, tying off the bandage with brisk efficiency. "Clean wound, missed the bone. You'll want to keep that arm still a good 6 weeks. And you'll want to thank whatever luck put Miss Dunmore's hands over that wound as fast as they got there, because you'd have bled a good deal worse without her." "Wasn't luck," Wade said, watching Josie across the crowded mercantile floor, giving her own account of events to a deputy with the same careful, precise composure she had once used to survey his own land under false pretenses. "Wasn't luck at all." He thought, watching her, of the note she'd left him the previous October. "Please don't come looking. I refuse to let it cost you your life and understand." Finally, the full shape of the year it had taken them both to arrive at this particular ending. She had run from him to keep him safe. He had let her run because he trusted her enough to believe her. And in the end, it had been neither of them running that broke Ashford's operation apart, but both of them, in their own ways, refusing to stay still and quiet while the wrong thing won. Wade's shoulder took 6 weeks to heal properly, and he spent most of them on his own porch, in his own chair, watching a ranch he had very nearly lost slowly become entirely, legally, permanently his own again. The Territorial Land Commission moved fast once Marcus Doyle's records and Josie's ledger were laid side by side in front of them fast enough that Randall Ashford was indicted before the end of that same summer. His company's charter revoked, its remaining assets seized to compensate the ranchers it had defrauded. Reeve Talbot faced trial for the shooting and for 2 other deaths the commission's investigators eventually connected to unexplained accidents along Ashford's survey lines, including, at last, official acknowledgement of what had truly happened to Josie's father. Marcus Doyle testified against both of them, and though the commission noted his own complicity in years of quiet paperwork, his final act of honesty and Wade's own testimony on his behalf earned him a second chance most men in his position never received. He left the territory that autumn to start over somewhere his old company's name would not follow him, and Wade, though he could not yet call it forgiveness, found he could at least call it understanding. Josie stayed. She sat with Wade on that porch most evenings through his recovery. Her father's real ledger finally retired from danger and kept instead in a plain wooden box on the mantel, evidence no longer of a crime in progress but of a wrong finally set right. She had a standing offer from the Territorial Commission to continue the investigative work she had proven, beyond doubt, she had a rare gift for, but when Wade asked her, one warm evening in September, what she intended to do next, she surprised them both with how quickly the answer came. "I intend," she said, "to stay somewhere that doesn't require me to lie about who I am to survive it." "This ranch isn't much," Wade said. "Cattle, fence line, more work than rest most seasons." "This ranch," Josie said, "is the first place in 2 years I haven't had to guard a satchel like my life depended on it." She reached into her coat and drew out something small, pressing it into his hand, the single pearl earring he had kept in a drawer for the better part of a year, returned now not as a farewell but as something closer to a promise. "I'd like to stop leaving things behind, Wade Calloway. I'd like to start keeping them instead." They were married the following spring, in a ceremony small enough that it fit entirely within the courtyard where, a year before, they had stood across from each other as strangers under armed guard. Otis stood as witness. Bramwell drew up the marriage filing himself, joking that it was the one document in his career he was certain, beyond any doubt, was entirely true. Ansel Prescott came to the wedding too, walking straighter than he had all the previous summer, his own land quietly restored to him once the Territorial Commission finished untangling every false filing Ashford's company had ever produced. He brought Wade a bottle of something considerably better than what Wade had seen him drinking on that porch the summer before, and clasped his hand a long moment before the ceremony began. Told you I didn't have the fight left in me, Ansel said. Glad to see somebody in this valley still did. Wasn't just me, Wade said, glancing toward Josie, radiant in a dress considerably plainer than the company linens she had once worn as armor, laughing at something Otis had said. Took a woman braver than both of us put together. Marcus wrote once, that first winter, from a small town in Montana where he had found work as an honest clerk for an honest company, the letter short and carefully worded, as though he was still not entirely sure he had earned the right to reach back toward the friendship he had nearly sold away. Wade wrote back longer than he intended to, and though the two men never quite recovered the easy closeness of boyhood, something more durable grew in its place, the particular respect two men can hold for each other once they have both, in their own ways, chosen honesty over the easier lie. The valley prospered in the years that followed, its small ranches secure at last under clean title and careful law, its people a little wiser for having watched, in a single summer, exactly how much damage could be done by paperwork nobody thought to question, and exactly how much good could come from one person willing to keep asking anyway. Wade liked to tell it, on quiet evenings with his own children gathered close, as a simple lesson dressed up in an old story. That the truth, however long it is buried, keeps better than any lie ever filed on top of it, and that the people trusting are rarely the ones who arrive with the smoothest paperwork, but the ones willing to risk everything to make sure the paperwork is finally honest. If you made it all the way to the end of this one with me, thank you for staying through every mile of it, the storm and the standoff and everything after. Stories like this one are the reason this channel exists, and the people who watch them to the end are the reason I keep making them. So before you go, hit subscribe if you haven't already, so you never miss the next story, and leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching this from. I read every single one, and I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story has traveled together.